Welcome to this episode of Art with Mrs. Cap. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the Edo period in Japan. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the art and the culture was like in the Edo period of Japan. All right, so a little bit of a brief history about Edo, Japan. Japan's Tokugawa Shogunate, which is also known as the Edo period. It lasted from 1603 to 1867. This would be the final period of traditional Japanese government and culture before what's known as the Meiji Restoration, which took place in 1868. And this toppled the long-reigning Tokugawa Shogunate and propelled the country into the modern era. Tokugawa Ieyasu's dynasty of shoguns presided over 250 years of peace and prosperity for Japan, including the rise of the new merchant class and increasing urbanization. The guard against external influences also worked to keep Japan kind of closed off from westernizing influences, including Christianity. And so they worked really hard to make it basically illegal for those things to be in operation. They wanted to keep like Japanese culture pure and uncontaminated by other influences. So the Tokugawa shogunate began to grow increasingly weak by the mid-19th century, and two powerful clans joined forces in early 1868 to seize power as part of an imperial restoration and named for Emperor Meiji. So the Meiji restoration marked the beginning of the end for feudalism in Japan and would lead to the emergence of a modern Japanese culture, politics, and society. So during the 1500s, power was decentralized in Japan. This tore apart, the country basically with, warring feudal lords, and this happened for nearly a century. Following his victory in the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who lived from 1543 to 1616, swiftly consolidated power from his heavily fortified castle in Edo, what is now Tokyo. The prestigious but largely powerless imperial court named Ieyasu as the shogun, or supreme military leader, in 1603. Beginning a dynasty that would rule Japan for the next 2.5 centuries. The Tokugawa shogunate prohibited trade with Western nations and prevented Japanese merchants from trading abroad. With the Act of Seclusion in 1636, Japan was effectively cut off from Western nations for the next 200 years, except for a small Dutch outpost that was in the Nagasaki harbor. At the same time, it maintained close relations with neighboring Korea and China, confirming the traditional East Asian political order with China at the center. All right, so let's look at the art and culture of the Edo period. In this lesson, we're going to look at the following. I won't go into the definitions of each of these because we're going to talk about them in detail in just a moment. But within the art and culture of the Edo period, we have different types of art and periods of art that take place within that period. So we have the Rinpa School of Painting. We have the Cano School. This was probably the most popular of the painting styles of the Edo period. We have Japanese literati painting. This comes from Chinese literati. We have the ukiyo-e woodblock prints. And then we have Zenga painting. This kind of comes from Zen Buddhist painting and calligraphy. And then we have crafts. Of course, most cultures have some form of arts and crafts. And so we're going to talk about a few traditional Japanese crafts. And then last, we have manga. And I'm sure this is one that several are excited about talking about. We're actually going to talk about the roots of manga, and how, it's like what we think of in modern terms of that word, actually draws its roots and its heritage back to the Edo period, which is really cool to think about. So let's go ahead and take a look at these different periods in detail. All right, so the Ripna School of Painting. There's a few little vocab words that go along with each of these schools, and you'll see those listed at the top. So we have lacquerware and swordsmith for this one. And so a lacquerware, it was just a decorative object that had basically a lacquer, which if you think it's kind of like a paint. That's an easy way to think about it. So it would be like some type of wood or something that had a lacquer on it. So in the early years of the Edo period, the Tokugawa policies had not yet truly made their impact. And so some of Japanese finest expressions in architecture and painting were produced by the Rinpa school. Rinpa artists worked in various formats. Notably, they did screens like those dividers that you have in a room, fans, hanging scrolls, woodblock printed books, lacquerware, ceramics, and kimono textiles. Many Rinpa paintings were used on the sliding doors and walls, fusuma, of noble homes. So if you know anything about Japanese style architecture, they actually have these like sliding panels between rooms. They don't necessarily have like doors that swing open like we think about, but there would be like panels. If you've seen anything like, oh, I'm trying to think of some popular culture examples. If you've seen like some of the Karate Kid movies, especially when they go to Japan, and I'm talking about the original Karate Kid movies, with Pat Morita. But anyway, if you go to, like, if you watch those and they go to Japan, you'll actually see those sliding doors and stuff, that are very, very traditional. So here we see those fusuma, and they had paintings, Rinpa paintings on those sliding panels. In 1615, Honami Koatsu founded the Rinpa School of Painting by establishing an artistic community of craftsmen supported by wealthy merchant patrons. And this was in northeast Kyoto. All right, so Koatsu collaborator Tawaraya Sotatsu maintained an atelier in Kyoto and produced commercial paintings such as decorative fans and folding screens. Sotatsu specialized in decorated paper, to which Koatsu added calligraphy. And if I am mutilating the Japanese language, I apologize. I did not study, Japanese in school, so I am doing my best to pronounce these the way I think they're pronounced, but, if I'm wrong, I apologize. All right, so like Koatsu and Sotatsu, as they pursued the classical Yomatoi genre, they also pioneered a new technique with bold outlines and striking color schemes. The Rinpa school was revived in the Ginroku era, which was from 1688 to 1704 by Ogatu Korin and Ogatu Kinzan. Korin's innovation was to depict nature as an abstract using numerous color and hue gradations and mixing colors on the surface to achieve eccentric effects. All right, the Cano School. The Cano School is one of the most famous of the Japanese painting styles, and it is the dominant style of painting from the late 15th century until about 1868, when the Meiji period began. All right. Literati, which we'll talk about in detail in a moment, these were well educated literary people. They were intellectuals who were interested in literature. All right, so the Cano School began by reflecting a renewed influence from Chinese painting and continued to produce monochrome brush paintings in the Chinese style over the next few years. However, the school simultaneously developed a brightly colored and firmly outlined style for large panels, which reflected distinctive Japanese traditions. The school was supported by the Shogunate, effectively representing an official style of art under the Edo period, in which art and culture were strictly regulated. This essentially monopolized the field of painting. The Kano school artists worked mainly for the nobility, the shoguns, and so forth, covering a wide range of styles and subjects and formats. While initially innovative from the 17th century onward, the artists became increasingly conservative and academic in their approach. All right, Japanese literati painting. All right, so here's a couple of vocabulary terms for you in this regard. We have sakoku, the foreign relations policy of Japan, in which strict regulations were applied to commerce and foreign relations by the shogunate. The policy stated that, with the exception of certain circumstances, no foreigner could enter, nor could any Japanese citizen leave the country on penalty of death. The policy was enacted by the Tokugawa shogunate from 1633 to 39 and remained in effect until 1853, with the arrival of the black ships of Commodore Matthew Perry and the forcible opening of Japan to Western trade. Bunjinga, a school of Japanese painting that flourished in the late Edo period among artists who considered themselves literati or intellectuals, also known as Manga. All right, so Japanese Bunjinga paintings usually were monochromatic black ink, sometimes with light landscapes, and nearly always depicting Chinese landscapes or similar subjects, were patterned after Chinese literati painting. So you can kind of see some examples of that, especially the one right next to me. Due to the Edo period policy of sakoku, Japanese literati artists were left with an incomplete view of Chinese literati ideas, and the Bunjinga style emerged from a fusion of Chinese and Japanese ideals. Japanese literati were not members of an academic intellectual bureaucracy like their Chinese counterparts, while the Chinese literati were academics aspiring to be painters. The Japanese literati were professionally trained painters aspiring to be the academics and intellectuals. Bunjinga painting almost always depicted traditional Chinese subjects, and artists focused almost exclusively on landscapes, birds, and flowers. As Japan became exposed to Western culture at the end of the Edo period, many Bunjinga artists began to incorporate stylistic elements of Western art into their own. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints. We're going to look at Hiroshige 1797 through 1858. This was a Japanese ukiyo-e artist and one of the last great artists in that tradition. Ukiyo-e is a Japanese woodblock print or painting that depicts everyday life. So this is a traditional Japanese style of art. And you actually have, there's an episode that coordinates with this lesson in the Art with Mrs. Cap podcast that focuses on the Great Wave of Kanagawa, all right, which is by Katsushika Hakusai, who lived from 1760 to 1849. He was a Japanese artist that was famous for his woodblock print series that was 36 views of Mount Fuji, which included perhaps one of the most famous Japanese woodblock prints, the Great Wave off Kanagawa. That's the one that you see right behind me. With rise of popular culture in the Edo period, a style of woodblock prints called ukiyo-e became a major art form. Its techniques were fine-tuned to produce colorful prints of everything from daily news to school books. Subject matter ranged from kabuki actors and the demi-monde of courtesans and famous landscapes. Ukiyo-e prints began to be produced in the late 17th century, with Harunobu producing the first polychrome print in 1764. The dominant artistic figure in the 19th century was Hakusai's contemporary Hiroshige, a creator of romantic and somewhat sentimental landscape prints. All right, Zenga painting. Here's a couple of vocabulary terms. Enso, a Japanese word meaning circle and a concept strongly associated with Zen. And you can kind of see an enso over to the side. That's circle painting there. And then Zenga is the Japanese term for the practice and art of Zen Buddhist painting and calligraphy. Zenga is a style of Japanese ink-based calligraphy and painting. In many instances, Zenga calligraphy and images are combined in the same piece, and calligraphy denotes a poem or saying that teaches some element to the path of Zen. The brush painting in Zenga is characteristically simple, bold, and abstract. In keeping with individual paths to enlightenment, nearly any subject matter can lend itself to Zenga. However, the Enso, sticks, and Mount Fuji are the most common elements. Crafts. So here's a couple of terms we're going to look at. Hinamatsuri. This is a traditional Japanese doll festival that's held every year on March 3rd. Edo, of course, we've been talking about Edo a lot. It is the former name of Tokyo. Temari is a folk craft born in ancient Japan from the desire to amuse and entertain children with a toy handball. Gofun, a smooth porcelain-like substance made from ground up oyster shells. And then lacquer, we mentioned earlier, it's a glossy resinous material that's used as a surface coating. So think of paint, but it's a little bit more than paint. It protects the surface and it dries, it cures, and it's like hard. Okay, so the craft of making temari or handballs evolved into an art in the early Edo period. These balls were made from strips of old kimono silk and exquisitely embroidered with complex decorative stitching. Another craft that developed during the Edo period, when Japan was closed to most international trade, was elaborate doll making. A market of wealthy individuals would pay for the most beautiful doll sets for their homes or as gifts. Japanese lacquer work reached its peak in the 17th century when lacquer was used to decorate a range of everyday items. The famous lacquerer Ogado Korin introduced a greater use of pewter and mother of pearl into lacquerware. Other important crafts during the Edo period include nishinjin, weaving, yuzen, dyeing, and the production of wadoke, or Japanese clocks. All right, manga. The history of manga is said to have originated from scrolls dating back to the 12th century, and it is believed that they represent the basis for the right-to-left reading style. The word first came into common usage in the late 18th century. Manga is a Japanese term that can be translated as comic. Historians and writers on manga history have described two broad and contemporary processes shaping modern manga. Their views differ in the relative importance, and they attribute the role of cultural and historical events following World War II versus the role of pre war Meiji and pre Meiji Japan culture and art. So a lot of influences involve the, like post World War II. They talk about how American, GIs brought with them comics, cartoons, like Disney cartoons especially, and brought those things over with them. And there was this influx of Western entertainment that influenced modern manga and what we see today as manga. Okay, so its roots go back many, many centuries ago, but it was greatly influenced post World War II with American GIs bringing an introduction of some of the entertainment that we had here. Katsushika Hakusai is considered to be the father of manga, as he produced the first printed materials called manga. So apart from their small size and, inexpensive woodblock technique, yellow covers were packed with comedy and satire in both their images and their text, including direct speech between characters like we see in modern comics. They were indeed comic books for adults like modern manga. Hakusai was incredibly inventive as an artist. He was always trying different genres and subjects, sometimes creating new ones. In the early 1800s, he collaborated with the leading author of long adventure stories, Bakin, and developed a wildly popular genre of popular fiction known as Yominyo, which is literally books for reading. Hakusai developed a new style of action-packed illustrations that were often filled with explosive drama. And you can kind of see that in the background over there. You see that explosion happening there. So the Hakusai manga, or the Hakusai sketches, is a collection of sketches of various subjects by the Japanese artist Hakusai. So subjects of the sketches include landscapes, flora and fauna, and everyday life, and the supernatural. So all of these are part of the roots of modern day manga. So it's very interesting how you can trace it all the way back to this time and even further. All right, so your project this week. You are doing your very own ukiyo-e print. All right, but we're going to do it a little bit different. We're not going to do a true woodblock print, but we're going to do something that's a little bit probably easier for you to find supplies to do this. With a woodblock print, you would actually have to have a block of wood. You would have to have a chisel and a hammer, and so that could be a little dangerous for your age group. But, and I don't want, I don't want anyone to get hurt. So we're going to do kind of an easier and cheaper way of doing this project. So you're going to need to get like a styrofoam plate, or you can recycle a styrofoam food container. So think like a to-go box from, like Zaxby's or Cookout or somewhere like that has those styrofoam old school, to-go boxes. Something like that will work as well. So if you don't have a styrofoam plate on hand, you can get, one of those food containers and repurpose it for this. So you're going to need scissors and then a dull pencil. There's a reason you want a dull pencil, and you'll see that when you actually do the project. You want a craft stick, a chopstick, or an other thin tool. So if you don't have a dull pencil, but you have like a craft stick or a chopstick or something like that, you can use those as well. Then you're going to need liquid coloring supplies such as ink or paint. I will leave this open to you. If you want to play around with ink, you can get some liquid ink from the craft store, or you can use your paint. You have, paint that you can use. Either of those, you just need some type of liquid, coloring material. And then you're going to need an extra plate, bowl, or cup for your liquid color, a paintbrush or a roller, and paper. So, but we'll get into all these details with our demo video. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I hope you enjoyed this lesson on the Edo period in Japanese art. See you next time on Art with Mrs. Cap.